like sunshine, like springtime, like something's in the water and I'm taking a deep dive. I'm feeling so weightless, like I'm gonna make it, and nothing in the universe can take this. I can see it clearly now, nothing gonna bring me down. I got my head held high, I'm on my way, and I'm following the signs to my happy place. I'm walking in the light of a brand new day, and I'm right where I belong, in my happy place. I got my head held high, I'm on my way, and I'm following the signs to my happy place. I'm walking in the light of a brand new day, and I'm right where I belong, in my happy place. And I'm right where I belong, in my happy place. And I'm right where I belong, in my happy place.
Welcome everybody to the National University of Singapore Yong Lulin School of Medicine Healthy Longevity webinar. I'm at the moment in Europe and I think that you're hearing the church bells in Zoeterwoude-dorp, so please excuse. Thank you for participating in our webinar today. We have a great guest today, and that is Professor Gordon Lynch, and he will tell us the latest secrets regarding muscle health. I assume that the presentation by Gordon Lynch will have lots of questions, and therewith I will ask you to use the Q&A function for your questions. But before introducing Gordon to you, Stephen Dinish, a very talented PhD student in our lab, is introducing the mechanisms of urolithin A. And maybe you haven't heard of it, but urolithin A is a natural compound that might have neuroprotective effects, making us maybe biologically younger. So, Stephen, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. My name is Stephen, and I'm a graduate student in the Center for Healthy Longevity. So one of the areas that we are working on in our lab is to investigate mitochondria-targeted therapeutics. Mitochondria dysfunction is one of the hallmarks of aging, and therapeutics that target the mitochondria are promising candidates. There are multiple mitochondria pathways that we can target for potential anti-aging benefits. And I'll give some examples. So firstly, improving fatty acid metabolism is one strategy. And this would also improve nutrient cycle to the TCA cycle, which would then feed into the electron transport chain. We can also try to improve the efficiency of electron transfer in the electron transport chain itself. Electron leak from the electron transport chain produces ROS, reactive oxygen species, which can cause a lot of damage and mutations to the mitochondria DNA and also the rest of the components of the mitochondria itself. So reducing this ROS is another approach to promote mitochondrial function. The third area that we can target would be the mitochondrial membrane potential, which is also affected with age. So restoring this potential can also help with mitochondrial function. Fourthly, we also can target the mitochondrial cristae architecture, which is largely lost in aged mitochondria. And this is important because many of the structures in the mitochondria, such as the electron transport chain, are anchored to the cristae itself. So apart from all these pathways and functions within the mitochondria, there are also suggestions that targeting mitochondrial dynamics, such as mitochondrial fission or fusion, may be of interest as well for aging. And of course, increasing the number of mitochondria through biogenesis and also eliminating the damaged mitochondria through mitophagy are also potential strategies. Among the therapeutics that promote mitochondrial health, urolithin A is an emerging compound which was only discovered about 5 years ago. Urolithin A is derived from the metabolism of polyphenols in the pomegranate fruit by the gut microbiota. However, only about 20 to 30% of the population have this specific bacteria that performs the conversion to urolithins. So ingesting as a supplement will help the remaining 70% of the population who do not have this bacteria. There have been multiple positive effects of urolithin A on health span and lifespan in a number of preclinical models, and also in different organ systems, from the heart to the brain, skeletal muscle, and even to the joints and immune system. Urolithin A has also shown to reduce the levels of protein aggregates and also the levels of inflammation. It has also shown to prevent myocardial dysfunction and improve skeletal muscle function. Urolithin A has also shown to be highly bioavailable in humans and can even pass through the blood-brain barrier. It also has a well-tolerated safety profile in phase 1 clinical trials. Urolithin A has achieved GRAS status, generally regarded as safe, by the FDA. So this means it can be marketed as a supplement online and purchased by consumers like yourself. Because the current data on urolithin A seems promising, in our lab, we are working on urolithin A to validate its anti-aging effects on multiple in vivo model organism species, including C. elegans, the African turquoise killifish, and mice models. In doing so, we aim to evaluate the robustness of urolithin A as an anti-aging therapeutic. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for this nice presentation about urolithin A. And hopefully we will at one point also test it in humans. But now it's really time to introduce Professor Gordon Lynch, and he is director of the Center for Muscle Research in the Department of Anatomy and Physiology at the University of Melbourne, where we met and worked together. And Professor Lynch is really a world leader in the study of muscle adaptation and plasticity, injury and regeneration, really everything which belongs to human muscle and muscle in animals. And he is also looking for treatments for muscle wasting relevant to aging, but also cancer and muscular dystrophy. I know, of course, Gordon very well from the academic side, but he is also a great communicator and promoting fitness and healthy aging. And every week you can hear Gordon on the national broadcast media, for example, the Australian ABC radio. So I'm really looking forward to you, Gordon, to your talk. The floor is absolutely yours.
Thank you very much, Andrea. A real pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity and to be invited to be part of this special theme about healthy longevity, which is, for me, as you may have surmised, my sort of passion is about muscle biology, but I also trained in gerontology many years ago, and I've been really pursuing that as a research interest for the last 25 to 30 years. So just wonderful to be part of this theme, and I'm hoping that some of the things I talk about will be relevant to practical translation effects as well. So let's see how we go. So I'd like to start by just asking the question, why is muscle, skeletal muscle in particular, so important? And I think the answer to that is muscle is essential for life. If we think about the very active breathing, the diaphragm muscle, which is a skeletal muscle, so underneath the rib cage here, responsible for inflating the lungs. We need the diaphragm to function if we want to breathe independently. For eating, the muscles of chewing, the muscles of swallowing, so essential for normal nutrition and the translation of nutrition to muscle. For posture and also for walking or jogging, cycling or swimming, all the muscles required through muscle contraction to allow us to perform those tasks. The other thing we need to point out is that muscle is also a metabolic organ. So muscle in its communication with other organs, whether it be muscle to the liver, muscle to fat, muscle to bone, there are a lot of inter-organ communication. So contracting muscles, releasing factors that signal and communicate with other tissues, including the brain. And so the aspect of exercise and mental health, the links are there to suggest that contracting muscles are release factors that circulate and get to all organs, and that inter-organ communication is essential. So from a practical level, muscle, in terms of performing the tasks of daily living, in terms of maintaining personal hygiene, that functional independence, it really is essential for life. And if we think about how we need to preserve muscle, there are many conditions in where muscle wasting and weakness are indicated. And the focus of this evening is about sarcopenia and its relationship to frailty, but conditions such as heart failure, artery disease, peripheral arterial disease, chronic kidney disease, respiratory disorders, metabolic disorders such as diabetes, a whole host of neuromuscular conditions. We have tumour bearing, which can result in muscle wasting and weakness. And over the last couple of years, we've realised the significance of COVID infection and long COVID and the neuromuscular weakness associated with some patients that have these very long-lasting symptoms. And the restoration of muscle health is critical in all of these particular conditions. So if we think about, well, what goes wrong with muscles as we get older, I'm afraid it's quite a sad and sobering tale. And I think we need to sort of appreciate the significance of this, because you don't necessarily wake up one morning and realise that your muscles have atrophied or become weaker. These things occur progressively over time. But over that period, particularly after the age of, say, 50 years of age, we have muscles becoming smaller, not always, but in many cases we get atrophy. So these are sort of dramatic examples to highlight the muscle wasting that could happen. This is the cross-section through the thigh muscle of an adult male of around about 48 years of age. You can see this is the femur here, the dark muscle tissue is just the meat on the bone, and the white areas are the sort of the connective tissue and fat that make up the overall cross-section. And when we compare that to an older individual, in this case 70, but could be actually older, there's quite a diminished meat on the bone and quite a considerable increase in non-contractile material, so fat and connective tissue infiltrating spaces where muscle should have been. So that's not surprising, I think, that if we have a loss of mass in that case, we do have this weakness. So this is an example here of maximum voluntary torque, so a leg extension exercise. This is age on this axis. And what we can see essentially are, I reckon, two populations here. One, which is essentially the normal population, and then after the age of 50, which I've sort of highlighted here, so 50 seems to be this spot where we need to be careful of, quite a steep decline in maximum voluntary torque. The most worrying thing about this is it's not just absolute terms where strength is decreased. Intrinsic force is lost. So force relative to the cross-sectional area of the muscle is also diminished. So we call that intrinsic weakness. And part of that could be because the fast muscle fibers that we rely upon for more dynamic activities, getting up out of a chair, opening a cupboard, getting up off a toilet, etc., there's some degree of velocity associated with those movements, and we rely upon the fast muscles to help perform those actions. In aging, the fast muscles seem to be preferentially affected. They undergo the greatest atrophy, they become weaker. The slow muscle fibers tend to become more resistant as a function of age. Overall, we have a general slowing of contraction. So the reason for that, with muscle contraction events being slower, it translates to slower actions generally. So movements become slower. Because they're slower, they're less precise. That means it could have implications for mobility, sudden falls, and of course the catastrophic events that could ensue, including fractures and worse. So a significant effect of age on muscle health from the structure of the muscle and, most importantly, the function of the muscle. So if we want to talk about healthy aging, we want to talk about longevity, we want to talk about successful aging, muscle health is integral to that equation. We need to ensure that we've got a preservation of muscle, a preservation not just of the structure but of function. And there are many aspects about the mechanisms of muscle contraction that I won't touch on specifically because we have to go into too much depth. But what we have to consider is that the muscular system is working in concert with other systems as well. We're not looking at necessarily organs in isolation. This is integrative physiology where we need to think about the communication between these tissues. But for healthy longevity, muscle health is at a premium. So I'd like us to sort of ask a question which I'll come back to as a theme during the presentation. And the question is, are the effects of aging on muscle inevitable? Are they immutable? Are they reversible? Or can they be attenuated? And I think each of us which has a sort of a vested interest in healthy longevity may have an opinion on the answer to that particular question, but I'll take you through how I feel in terms of the answer to that question. I think the easiest way, or the best way to describe it first and foremost, is that evidence is very clear that some of these effects of aging on muscle structure and function can be attenuated. In particular, if we think about what actions we can take, exercise and nutrition are paramount. And in the ideal scenario, so note that I'm talking about in the ideal scenario here, strength training or resistance training, lifting weights or working muscles against resistance as part of an exercise prescription for healthy aging. And that would include resistance training with aerobic exercises for cardiorespiratory fitness, flexibility or range of motion around joints, and also balance, of course, because of the propensity for falls and fractures, etc. If strength training is our mainstay for preserving muscle health, that's also in conjunction with a healthy eating plan. And that eating plan is about meeting the protein needs for healthy older adults. In particular, we know about the maintenance of muscle mass is essential with the protein intake from the diet. Other aspects when we talk about healthy longevity, clearly there are aspects of the Mediterranean diet which are in favour that may also benefit muscle health, and of course the literature, the scientific literature, but also the popular press, and of course all over social media you will see a range of emerging approaches, some tried, some quite hypothetical, in terms of ways in which we can preserve the structure and the function of muscle. So let's go back to our question. Are the effects of aging on skeletal muscle health inevitable? And I ask that question that even if we're doing all the right things, so I've talked about exercise and nutrition as ways we can attenuate, are these effects inevitable even if we do the right things? And I want to sort of take a story through muscle health, through muscle performance, to try and answer that particular question. Let's look at exercise performance. We've got 200-metre sprint running, and we've got marathon performance. We've got speed on this axis and advancing age on this axis. And what you can see very clearly, whether it be for sprint performance or whether it be for endurance running, we simply don't perform the same way we did when we were younger. As we get older, speed is dropping off in this case. And I'm not talking about couch potatoes that have been asked to go and do these activities. I'm talking about masters level athletes, athletes that train and compete for a large proportion of their life, adhering to the best exercise nutrition to ensure that they're performing as best they can. But despite that, performance in both sprinting and in marathon are not the same as that was when these athletes were younger. On the right-hand side, we can see another example. We've got masters level weightlifting. So with weightlifting, a more dynamic activity, explosive types of events where we need to dynamically perform these exercises, we can see basically an even greater drop-off in performance as a function of age. With advancing age on this axis and performance as a percentage of peak, we're not performing the same way we did when we were younger. So even if we're adhering to the best exercises and the best nutrition, we're not able to sustain the performance as we did when we were younger. Now, that means that even these people who are genetically gifted, so elite level endurance athletes, elite level sprinters or power athletes, they're not performing the same way. However, the reality of this is that people are adhering to these best practices in terms of nutrition and in terms of exercise most likely they're the ones that will be having these different trajectories from the normal population in terms of a healthy aging, an improved health span, and also lifespan. So ideally, when we're talking about longevity, we're talking about functional independence, the ability to have a quality of life. We're living longer. My contention currently is that, are we necessarily living any better? And so if the quality of life is not going hand in glove with an increased lifespan, then something's wrong. So we need to consider these factors when we're considering what it means for healthy longevity. I want to take you through an example of someone who has adhered to this best practice of exercise and nutrition. This is Dr. John Turner at the age of 67. This is perhaps one of the most widely circulated images on the internet. If you're interested in longevity, you will have seen this, and I use this in my teaching for the last 30 years at the university. And I'm very envious of John Turner in terms of that physique. You can see at the age of 67, a very impressive degree of musculature and obviously functionally independent and able to perform the tasks of daily living. Here he is at the age of 79, so 12 years later, and again, he's adhered to resistance training and, of course, the nutrition that goes with enabling that to be performed at optimum. And you can see at the age of 79, John Turner is also looking pretty impressive. I think they've even given him a heavier pair of dumbbells to show that he's been doing pretty well. So hats off to John Turner. But that's not the message I want you to take from this example. When we compare John Turner at the age of 67 and John Turner at the age of 79, yes, impressive. But what you'll note, despite adhering to the best exercise and nutrition, which we believe for healthy aging that he's been doing throughout this period, very clearly we've still got deficits in the amount of muscle mass, the quality of muscle that's present. So there are deficits that are occurring despite best practice. And we need to be mindful of that, to know that exercise and nutrition may not be all that's necessary for healthy aging. This is another slide that I've been using for many, many years in my teaching in medical physiology. And I've got muscle mass here, so existing in its homeostatic state. This balance between the synthesis of protein and the degradation of protein will determine whether the muscle grows or hypertrophies or whether it shrinks or atrophies. This balance between synthesis and degradation of protein. And what you can see in terms of this is not an all-inclusive list, this is just some of the factors involved that may be manipulating this balance between synthesis and degradation of protein. It could be the foods that we eat. It could be the circulating levels of anabolic hormones that act upon muscle to sustain it at a particular size. It could be the genetic makeup. We talked about those even genetically selected for elite performance, still showing sarcopenia. Whether a muscle is innervated, whether it has an electrical connection, a nerve connecting and telling a muscle what to do. If that electrical connection is lost or in some way compromised, then clearly we're going to be impacting upon the muscle's ability to sustain its size and its strength. With aging, we have inflammation and oxidative stress in many cases that will be impacting upon signaling pathways that will interfere with the nutrition that's enabling us to maintain this normal state. Blood flow is another factor, physical activity, as we've stated, and of course, the development of many other diseases and conditions that could be contributing to overall maintenance of muscle mass. So my point is that if we're doing the best approach to nutrition in terms of protein needs, if we're doing the best exercises, biasing it towards strength training to preserve muscle health, what you can see is that there are many other factors that need to be taken into consideration. So when we look at this, I sort of look at this analogy of the bucket with the holes. We've got our best inputs, exercise, we've got our best input, nutrition, filling this bucket. But unfortunately with aging, with advancing age, we've got holes appearing in this bucket where it's very difficult to maintain muscle. And unfortunately, in this case, we've got this degradation exceeding protein synthesis, where we would have muscle atrophy occurring. And I've discussed some of these factors already. It could be because of a chronic low-grade systemic inflammation that's present, and that inflammation could be interfering with what's the trigger for muscle protein synthesis. We need to feed muscle with protein to stimulate protein synthesis. Potentially, this systemic inflammation could be interfering with those signaling pathways, the so-called anabolic resistance, putting food in, but the bucket's got too many holes and we're not able to sustain the muscle mass. It could be because of circulating hormones, in particular the sex hormones, would it be testosterone or estrogen. It could be these hormones are diminished in their circulating levels, and that will impact upon the ability to maintain protein synthesis. But I also want you to consider the patency of the neuromuscular junction, the contact between the nerve and the muscle. And it could be from the nerve itself, or it could be the contact point where the nerve attaches to the muscle. If we've got any compromisation of that patent connection, then we're going to be interfering with this ability, because protein signaling will be affected. And the other thing I want you to sort of take into consideration, which is not widely published as yet, but certainly we're learning a lot more about the family of proteins located at the muscle membrane, in particular the dystrophin glycoprotein complex, most prominent in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, where there's an absence of dystrophin, which disrupts this complex and leaves muscles highly fragile and susceptible to weakness and also to infiltration of cations, etc. But we're learning, even with aging, that we can have a disruption of these proteins at the muscle membrane, which may be implicated not just for force transmission, but also the normal signaling that's required to maintain muscle in its homeostatic state. And if it's lost, it will be tipping this balance in favour of degradation instead of protein synthesis. Okay, so let's go back to our question. Are the effects of ageing on muscle health immutable? Can we reverse what's being done? Highly desirable if that's the case. And there's been a lot published in this area, and we and others over the last 20 years or so have synthesized the literature looking at different ways. I'm just focusing here on perhaps the hormonal interventions that may be present, whether it be growth hormone or testosterone stimulation, growth factors like insulin like growth factor 1 or other growth factors. It could be about inhibiting myostatin to change muscle size, or selective androgen receptor modulators. All of these have been well characterized. All of them show potential, but in many cases, generally speaking, there is a potential for off-target effects for many of these growth factors, and we've studied many of them and published many studies on these anabolic hormones and anabolic growth factors. They can have off-target effects, particularly on the cardiovascular system, which of course will limit their clinical application. So it's always this balance between risk and benefit. There are many powerful anabolics out there, but safe application for widespread clinical usage, it doesn't stop there being many healthy aging clinics around the world administering these compounds, but for widespread clinical application, there are still some ways to go. And so I think, as I said to you before, there are many emerging treatments that have been tested and some that have yet to be tested in a proper, rigorous fashion. I also want to take you back to the exercise and nutrition as our basic inputs. And I put before the ideal case, and I've changed the word here to call it about reality, the reality of the situation. Even though I'm a very strong advocate, as you can appreciate, for exercise and for strength training in particular, there's no doubt that people in their 80s, 90s, and even centenarians living in nursing homes in the United States, given these resistance training programs, still respond. So the very positive benefit here is that the muscle is still responsive, even in very old age, to that particular stimulus. But the sort of training that I think will go towards this reversibility, or the ability to prevent these age-related effects, we need to train in a very dynamic fashion. I've given an example here of these dynamic power type exercises, much higher intensity. They're dynamic exercises that are multiple joints from the ankle through to the knees, through to the hips, through to the shoulders. And if we can extend that, it's going to be through the arms as well. So these multi-joint exercises, they're tough for anyone, even for fit young adults, let alone, and when I was younger, I was really strongly advocating power training, true power training. And there are various ways we can call power training, and it's done in different ways around the world. But typically, many older adults cannot perform these very high intensity exercises that may be the most conducive for muscle health. And as I'm getting older, I'm 57 now, been training since I was 15, it's getting much harder for me to perform these exercises that I still do my best, but the propensity for injury increases as well. So like everything else, we have to compromise. So it's natural that this has to be the case. We're not necessarily performing optimum. We're doing lower intensity exercise, more gentle types of exercises, circuits involving maybe machines rather than free weights, etc. But regardless of that, exercise is still king, in my opinion, but the training for it to be effective has to be consistent. It has to be progressive. And most of all, it has to be challenging, regardless of age. The other aspect is the reality of nutrition. And it's very easy for people to say, make sure you eat protein and make sure you rotate different meats, etc., in the diet if you're a carnivore, or if you're a vegetarian, harder choices, but it's still possible. But the reality is there are differences in terms of the digestibility of proteins for different people. Some people have difficulty in chewing because the muscles are affected in terms of swallowing, the efficiency of the amino acid uptake, the kinetics of absorption. In many cases, when I talked to you before about the inflammatory situation, in many cases where we may have chronic low-grade inflammation, that's going to be interfering with the protein signaling required to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, most especially leucine, which is the most responsive amino acid which stimulates protein synthesis. That cannot stimulate muscle protein synthesis during these inflammatory events. And so I wanted to just touch on very briefly some of the work we've been doing to try and overcome this anabolic resistance. And that's through our work using the amino acid glycine, somewhat underappreciated amino acid. It's a non-essential amino acid. Sometimes that term non-essential means it sort of gets put onto the back pile. But in fact, it has, in our hands and in many others, shown to have very powerful anti-inflammatory effects and cell protective effects that could be very useful in a situation where we've got muscle wasting conditions, most especially those with inflammation as a contributing factor. In our hands, we've shown that glycine feeding can restore the anabolic response to leucine. And that's really important when we're thinking about this balance between synthesis and degradation of protein, if we want to stimulate protein synthesis to win out. We believe that dietary supplementation with glycine can have protective effects for muscle. And we've done multiple studies with cancer cachexia in animals. This is in mouse models of various conditions, sepsis, dietary restriction, and our contention, quite strong one, is that it has relevance for sarcopenia as well. This is an example in tumour bearing. These are mice that are bearing colon 26 tumours. And you can see the tumour here. It causes significant muscle wasting of these muscles of the lower hind limb. In our hands, in terms of a feeding study where we fed glycine to these mice that were bearing these colon 26 tumours, we found that the glycine supplementation was able to attenuate the loss of muscle mass that occurs when tumour bearing. In addition, so that's both in terms of the size of individual fibres and the overall muscle mass, but also in terms of inflammatory signaling, which is quite prevalent in these cancer models. The glycine feeding was able to attenuate the inflammatory response. So quite an important response when we're talking about cancer. In another situation where we injected mice with lipopolysaccharide to cause sepsis, and that the sepsis causes infection, which causes muscle wasting, what we showed was that glycine feeding was able to restore that leucine-stimulated muscle protein synthesis. So this was a very important discovery for us, that it could restore that or overcome that anabolic resistance that we would normally see in these inflammatory conditions. And associated with that was this reduction in reactive oxygen species generation with glycine feeding. So a couple of important things that we think have relevance. In the case of infection and sepsis, that has obvious applications for the intensive care unit. So our work with intensivists is now looking at this in patient trials, looking at safety and efficacy of glycine in an ICU. And my contention here is, of course, that it has relevance for the wasting and weakness associated with sarcopenia, most especially if there are conditions where inflammation is indicated. In the final part of my presentation, just to wrap things up, I want to think about the future. So I've talked about things that are being published and things that are emerging. This is something which is forward thinking, future thinking about how we might preserve muscle health and strategies that we might do that, and some of the emerging technologies that we're using to try and tackle muscle wasting for sarcopenia and many other muscle wasting conditions. So the questions that we've got here that really prompt our discovery research include, can we change attributes of the muscle, like the size of the muscle or the metabolism of the muscle, to produce a muscle phenotype of our choosing? So if we change muscle phenotype, is it possible that we can offset these effects of aging in the context of healthy longevity? So what sort of attributes am I talking about? Well, I think what I've discussed with you so far is that some of the changes that we see with aging relate to the loss of muscle mass, the loss of muscle fiber size, so the cells are changing in size, they're atrophying, strength is decreasing, and in many cases, older adults are complaining about fatigue and the metabolic fatigue that may be associated with some of these changes. In many cases, these factors will impact significantly on quality of life, functional independence, the safety of older adults working for longer in the workplace, and the productivity of those individuals. So safety and productivity in the workplace, especially for older adults in the workforce, is a pretty important one that governments need to be taking notice of. But most importantly, from a healthcare perspective, is that we want to delay the time that older adults need to go into aged care. Well, what sort of attributes am I talking about? Well, for strength, we want a larger muscle fiber, something which is going to confer those strength and power properties. And the other aspect is we want to improve the resistance to fatigue, to go through the tasks of daily living without getting tired. So the wish list is larger oxidative fibers. That sounds fantastic, except that nature has other ideas. Because typically in nature, muscle growth tends to occur at the expense of oxidative capacity. And that's work done by my colleague in Amsterdam, Richard Jaspers. Across species, they've shown that as muscles increase in their size, their oxidative capacity decreases. So we start off here in terms of the muscle phenotype, a small muscle with a very high endurance capacity. That's reflected in this mitochondrial reaction here of these fibers, darkly staining, meaning they're highly oxidative. And as we grow the muscle, as we shift to this axis, what we can see here is that these muscles are paler, indicating they're more glycolytic. So muscle is growing at the expense of its oxidative capacity. So nature is telling us that maybe we can't achieve what we want. But if we could change this relationship, to push this relationship in this direction, where we can grow muscle fibers and at the same time enhance oxidative capacity, I think you'll agree that the implications are quite significant, not just for healthy aging, but if we think about animal production in terms of livestock and aquaculture, where we could produce muscles that are larger and more oxidative that will be tender and tasty. In many cases, these are aspects. My lights have gone off here. I mentioned before about enhancing work performance, and that's really important. If we've got larger muscles that can do more work and not get fatigued, that's going to be about productivity, but most importantly, about safety. Naturally, for our concept of healthy longevity, we're going to be able to go through tasks of daily living for longer, and a new aspect or a newer aspect of our research in terms of cellular agriculture, trying to create muscle in vitro, which has the properties that may be suitable for complementing what will occur in the normal livestock production. How do we do this? Well, within the Centre for Muscle Research, we have sort of a toolkit involving recombinant adeno-associated viral technologies that can drive these muscle-specific attributes. So we use genes such as follistatin to produce larger muscles. And you can see an example here from my work from my colleague and friend, Paul Gregorowicz. These are intramuscular injections of these recombinant adeno-associated viruses driving expression of follistatin. This is the muscle that's been injected with the vector with follistatin. This is the empty control vector. You can see this massive muscle, and you can see at the cellular level these football-sized muscle fibers compared to the control. Very clearly, within 4 weeks, a substantial increase in muscle mass. Similarly, we're looking at how we can improve oxidative capacity, and a lot of the work we've published, including work, I will draw your attention to work we published earlier this year, identifying estrogen-related receptor gamma to try and promote oxidative capacity within muscle. So what we're trying to do, and I'm sort of sharing my insights with our Discovery Muscle program, is that we want to do these overexpressions alone, so we can stimulate muscles with follistatin alone to produce maybe a very large, but perhaps a glycolytic muscle. We can inject muscles with estrogen-related receptor gamma and produce a smaller muscle that's highly oxidative, but also combine them. And so if we combine these two stimuli, perhaps we can drive a muscle which is both larger and more oxidative. And we're doing this in different ways as well, not just the straight combination, but perhaps sequential. So growth followed by oxidative, oxidative followed by growth. What about the combination of these strategies with exercise? And we're looking at those interventions as well. But my contention is that for healthy longevity, so thinking to the future, thinking about discovery muscle biology and how that may be translated in the future, if we're able to remodel a muscle successfully, that we could be able to protect against these changes in muscle health, not just with aging, and that's the focus of what we're discussing today, but for many other conditions as well. It could be muscle diseases and conditions like the dystrophies. It could be about patients that have muscle wasting and weakness associated with cancer or cancer treatments. Really significant clinical unmet need. But these are future thinking. We're at the discovery stage now, but I believe that in the future, these could become a reality in terms of how they may be translated to human health. Just to close, I'm very grateful to our funders for their support of our research program. I'm very grateful and privileged to work in the Centre for Muscle Research, a university centre at the University of Melbourne that I have the privilege of directing. And I just want to say thank you once again to Professor Meyer and Professor Kennedy for the opportunity to present our research and to give my thoughts about how we might approach healthy longevity. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gordon. It was a pleasure hearing the latest research you're doing and the plans you have. Let me start with the first question. What is the optimal muscle mass for individuals, and is more always better?
When I was younger, Andrea, I had this view that more was better. I do not agree with that now. I don't think we need, well, who needs big muscles? What we need are functional muscles. And I really believe in terms of the exercise programs and the development of power, etc., the emphasis should not be about making muscles bigger. It's about preserving muscle size. We need an appreciable level of muscle size and the maintenance of muscle mass, but it has to be functional tissue. So the emphasis must be on the physiology. It must be on the development of, the ability to generate force and power are the most important attributes. And that's not necessarily about bigger muscles being better. It's about better muscles being those that can actually contract for longer, perhaps without fatiguing, but allowing people to go through their tasks of daily living and ideally without getting too tired as well.
That's a relief, Gordon. But that brings me a little bit to the next question. You showed a very nice slide, I think was published already 20 years ago, about the maximum voluntary torque. And there is something happening at the age of 50. What's happening at, I saw the sprinters at the age of 25, where was the decline? And then the torque and power at the age of 50. What's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the key question. Is it at the age of 50, or things have started to change a lot earlier than that? And so this is about not looking at that and saying, well, I better do something when I turn 50 so that I don't go down this steep decline. That's the wrong view. The view is to say, well, how do we flatten the curve? It's using sort of COVID technology, but we were using it a lot before that. The idea is that what we want to do is preventive. And so what we want to make sure that before we get anywhere close to 50, that we're preserving muscle, that we're preserving the functional aspects of muscle, because in many cases you will see that the function is decreasing and there is this sort of disconnect between muscle mass and muscle function. And dynapenia is a term that's often used to describe that disconnect. So there are intrinsic changes that are happening within the muscle, from all the way from, I talked about the electrical connections between the neuromuscular junction to stimulate, but the release of calcium from internal stores. These are time-dependent events to allow channels to open, to release calcium from that store, to allow cross bridges to cycle. How long a cross bridge is attached, how quickly it detaches. All of these factors impact upon how muscles function. And all of those are potential sites at which aging can occur in terms of its deficit. And there are strategies already in place in terms of modulating at the sarcomere, certain troponin activators, so the way in which calcium binds to these proteins to allow cross-bridge cycling to occur. There are many strategies that are now in trials and being applied already in different conditions that may modulate the way in which muscle contraction occurs. That may have benefits for sarcopenia. In some cases, for muscular dystrophy is more apparent, but that sort of disconnect really tells us that there are intrinsic changes that we need to address as well, rather than just looking at the superficial side and say, well, I'll just do this and that. There are many other things that can be addressed, and it takes more than just exercise and nutrition to address those issues.
Yeah, and that brings me to my next question. The exercise and nutrition, I think, is a wonderful thing because everybody could do it, and we could already prescribe it now because we know what to do. Is there then that I need at different age categories, different exercises? You touched on it a little bit, but also different amino acids to supplement, for example, from a nutritional point of view?
But I'd say potentially. Certainly, the capacity to perform different tasks will change. And I notice that even as someone who's trained for such a long time as I have in terms of my capacity to do certain types of activities, it doesn't stop me from wanting to keep training and doing what I believe are the best exercises. But your point is that at different ages are there different exercises. Going from nothing to something is the start. And in many cases, people aren't doing any exercise whatsoever, or they're involved in things in a transient nature and are not being. It's about consistency, and that's for regardless of age, consistent performance but also making sure that the training is progressive in nature, doing the same thing over and over. Very clearly, our muscles adapt pretty well to challenge, but the challenge has to be different in order to produce a higher level of adaptation or a different type of adaptation. So training across, if we think about a training year, and the term, we use this term periodization, where we can train different aspects of muscle health at different times of the year. That's one way to keep it interesting. Keeping people engaged with exercise is another factor. So there are many programs, we know exercise works, etc., etc. Well, make sure that people keep with the program. How do we do that? How do we ensure that these programs are sustainable, that people are wanting to do that exercises and will derive the benefits if the program design is appropriate? And that's really coming down to individual programs suited for that person, because they, with aging, of course, they may have different existing health conditions, and we need to make sure that we're designing programs that work around and don't aggravate those particular conditions. But in most cases, exercise is going to be beneficial if we can choose the right ones.
That's very clear. And I hear often back from my patients where, for example, diagnosed sarcopenia, that they say, is there also a pill? And I really heard from your talk that there are lots of side effects, of course, with testosterone, growth hormones, etc. So anabolic stimuli, which have lots of risks, also inducing cancer, for example. So is there something in the pipeline you know of that there might be a chance to also have a pill for the ones who might not want to exercise? And of course, there might also be an ethical component to it, prescribing a pill if we could do it with exercise. What's your take on that?
Well, we are doing research into that area, because in many cases, what we're doing with our exercise programs is, well, how can we actually optimize exercise if we also use maybe pharmacologic activators that may be similar in nature? So there are many well-known oxidative program type drugs, and metformin is a classic example. There are many types of drugs that have of a similar benefit that activate AMPK, so AMPK activation, and we're looking at ways in which we can trigger AMPK activation pharmacologically. So looking at the pill alone, but also comparing that with exercise and potentially the combinations, because it could be that when we've got many conditions that may be interfering with the adaptive response. So the plastic response, the muscle plasticity, the ability to adapt to the challenge may be compromised in certain situations. So it may be that the pharmacological activator can help derive greater benefits from the physical activity. Our contention, or my contention as a physiologist, is that the mechanical contractions, muscle contractile activity, produces an adaptive response that could be different from that of a pharmacological activator of a particular signaling pathway. But the combination of that contractile activity with the pharmacological activator could be the superior option. And I think that's a lot of where our research is going, is how we can marry the two. In many cases, we work, of course, with muscle diseases where patients are in wheelchairs and unable to exercise. How can they derive the benefit of exercise if they're not able to do that? And that's where the pharmacological activators could be producing those exercise-like adaptations.
Absolutely, I fully agree with you. Sometimes I also think that the knowledge laymen have around muscle aging and muscle health and how to prevent decline in muscle mass and muscle strength is not yet very good. So I would really like to hear your opinion about how we could improve that and what we should do, before giving the word to Chandrira, who has lots of questions from the audience.
So is your question more about the promotion of what we would do?
Yes.
Yeah, I think there are whole divisions of exercise promotion within the research, and they sort of tend to go over the same ground. And, the messages are clear that exercise works. Well, why aren't people doing it? Why aren't they taking it up? And why do they stop? And this has been an ongoing, if we think about prioritization, if we know about the benefits of exercise for health, my engagement, as I've been doing, as you know, for a couple of decades now each week, is to try and engage the audience with understanding that this is a personal responsibility. We have the option here of changing the way that we feel, of improving our chances potentially of not having certain conditions. There's no guarantee about these things, and that's another thing we need to say. These aren't fail-safes. Exercise does not necessarily protect you from all these things. It may help in some ways, but it's not a fail-safe. And I think the honest appraisal about what exercise can be achieved, I think, is a message which needs to be better articulated, because I think people think, well, I can't do these sorts of exercises, I can't benefit. Well, there are ways in which we can do it, and it's the choice, the individualisation of those programs. We need to consider that a lot more than it currently is. It's not just picking up a newspaper and saying, oh, I see this program, I think I'll follow it. It may not be the most effective for you.
Tanjira, you really like muscle and you just started your PhD on it. What kind of questions do we have in the chat?
Thank you, Andrea, for the introduction. And thank you, Gordon, for the very interesting talk. I really enjoyed myself. So we have a lot of questions from the floor, actually. So let's start with Dongwei, who asked, so what inspired the team to focus on follistatin and estrogen receptor gamma for maintenance of muscle mass? These are closely related to ovarian health and aging, especially in postmenopausal women when they experience osteoporosis and likely sarcopenia as soon as they reach menopause.
Yeah, so when I'm talking about the stimulation of that receptor, it's different from talking about the loss of estrogen, etc., where this is a very specific gene target that we identified through what we did was a program of electrical stimulation in mice, looking at healthy and various dystrophic models. It was published in Molecular Metabolism in early, I think, in January of this year. So we've published this, the biggest hits that we saw from the transcriptome responses from electrical stimulation. So this was wireless, so implantable electrodes into mice, wirelessly stimulated. So the muscles were stimulated at 10 pulses per second, or 10 hertz. And we got muscles that converted from fast twitch to slow. We changed muscles that were glycolytic into oxidative. And during that muscle reprogramming, or programming of muscle from one type to another, the transcriptome hits were clearly, in the case of the estrogen-related receptor gamma, was one of our big hits. And that's why we've targeted that to push an oxidative program. Follistatin, we've done a lot of work with myostatin antibodies. So we know that myostatin is one of those things. If we keep myostatin levels very low, we can get hypertrophy. Typically, if myostatin levels start to rise, it sort of pushes a program to make muscles smaller. So with follistatin, which is even more powerful than knocking down myostatin, which because it binds myostatin and various other aspects of the pathway, combining the growth through follistatin and targeting this very strongly activating oxidative program, we think are the best ways to do it. But it's not the only two pathways. There are multiple other ways in which we can do this. But in our hands, the question was, how do we get there? It was because of these previous experiments which identified what we should be following in these next studies.
We have another question from Christopher. So Christopher says, a recent study showed that sarcopenia is associated with incident Alzheimer's dementia, mild cognitive impairment, and cognitive decline, but that this was driven by muscle function and not lean muscle mass. So do you think that your proposed means to improve muscle function may also affect the brain?
It's a very good question, and I say wholeheartedly yes. And it comes back to how we talk about this inter-organ communication, that contracting muscles release factors, and there's been, I think it was work published earlier this week, showing that contracting muscles can release factors that circulate and can target the brain. So we're talking about, the exercise high that people get from exercising. It's very clear that we've got some signaling happening which is crossing the blood-brain barrier and having the benefits for potentially for in terms of nerve cell health, I think that's very important. If we think about in Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and many other neurodegenerative conditions, exercise is being shown to have benefits. But it's not about, as I think as the question is alluding, it's not about the mass per se of the muscle. Yes, we need an appreciable level of muscle mass, but it's more about retaining the contractility of that muscle, the ability of the muscle to contract through exercise that will derive these benefits. So I think it's imperative. I think humans are built for exercise. We have to keep active. And very clearly, it's not the only thing. Of course, we've shown that that's not the only factor, but it's an important contributing factor to whole body health, not about muscle health per se, not necessarily about musculoskeletal health. It's about the communication of contracting muscles, releasing factors that communicate with and maintain the health of other tissues, and how those tissues actually may sustain the muscle. So we're doing work now looking at the muscle-bone axis in terms of the signaling that may keep how bones may adapt to changes in exercise. But think about the surrounding organs. All of them are communicating with each other. And we're really only just starting to learn more about the significance of that inter-organ communication.
Thank you, Gordon, for the very insightful answer. So we have another question from Diogo. So does hormone replacement therapy truly help in delaying sarcopenia?
Yeah, so the answer to that is in some cases successfully, in other cases unsuccessfully. The idea of risk-benefit, this is the big thing for especially going back 20 years or so when hormone replacement was being pushed quite strongly. The risks were found to outweigh the benefits, and so it went out of favour. It doesn't stop many sort of healthy aging clinics around the world, in particular in the US, where hormone replacement, or if we know that circulating levels of testosterone or whatever are declining, does it not make sense that we should top up those levels to what they should be when they were younger? And if you think about the argument, it sounds pretty sound, except that the temptation, of course, is that if a teaspoon is good, then a tablespoon must be 10 times better. Well, in fact, of course, when we're talking about manipulating hormones and upsetting homeostasis, you've got a recipe for disaster. And that's where the triggering of other health conditions because of excess levels of hormones and causing deficiencies in others becomes it's not, because of the individual aspect of the physiology of that person, it's not necessarily a recipe that one dose fits all. This really has to be done in consultation with an endocrinologist who's working closely with patients that can monitor many aspects of health during that hormone replacement. In that supervised status, very clearly there are many beneficial effects for some patients that require it. But often we see, because it's often the sports in terms of bodybuilders and other things that are using these sorts of very powerful hormones, and not just 1 or 2 or 10, it could be a whole a litany of recipes of different concoctions that they're using, and it's very worrying for those that really are lifelong devotees to these sorts of things, to see what people are doing to themselves. It's quite staggering, actually.
Gordon, thank you very much for highlighting that. So no multiple to train your muscle, but the exercise is very important. Janjira, the last question from the audience.
Okay, here's one from David. So is there a gender difference with regards to the mechanism of initiation and progression of muscle wasting and weakness during aging?
It's a good question. In terms of, if we go back to the concept of the circulating hormones, certainly there are differences in terms of changes in hormone levels, sex hormone levels at different stages of life. That may be an initiating factor for some people, but for others it could be other health-related conditions that contribute. So I think in both cases, we think about is one sex better protected than another? In some cases, we see males more affected, showing greater wasting. But again, I think this emphasis on wasting is changing now. I think we're seeing more in terms of the definitions that clinicians are advocating to diagnose people is de-emphasizing the mass of the muscle, because it's very difficult to diagnose very easily, and thinking more about the functional aspects. In terms of the sexes, I think we see age-related decline in muscle function pretty similar in males and females, but the rate of decline will differ, in particular with these hormone levels.
Thank you. Great discussion, Gordon. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to your results of the next coming 5 years to hopefully to prevent sarcopenia. Thank you very much.
Much appreciated.
I would like to ask everybody to leave us some comments and feedback, of course. So use the panelists and all attendees option. The next speaker next week will be Professor James Kirkland on the 9th of December. And of course, Professor James Kirkland will talk about cellular senescence and senolytics. And hopefully also at a certain time, the translation into the humans, and it will be hosted by Brian Kennedy. We are closing today, of course, also with a video, and in that video, people ask the perception of what really old is. So hopefully you stay tuned. I would say stay distant and to stay safe during these times of the Omicron variant, and take care.
My name is Paolo. I'm 25 years old.
My name is Daniela, and I'm 19.
24.
35.
31. 33.
I'm 26 years old.
What age do you consider to be old?
Late 40s?
Maybe 50.
I feel like 30 is a new 20, so I'd say like 40 is old.
I'd probably say 50s.
Hang on, there's someone I want you to meet.
Hello, I'm Birch. I'm 66.
Hi, I'm Daphne, and I'm 68.
I'm Dee, and I'm 55.
George Fassbinder, 75.
Wow. My name is Parvati. I'm 70.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
We're going to give you about 2 minutes to teach each other something that you are good at.
Both of your legs go up, and your arm goes up, and your left arm goes like to the side. Ready?
Okay.
1, 2, 3. Lift 1, 2, 3. And bring it to your heart. And bring it to your heart. Add the head in. Yeah.
You want to try to get your balance and raise up.
Now, you can bring your legs and your feet up.
It's hard, right?
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7. So when you come out of a turn, either way, you go back to that basics.
Over. Now forward. Over. Yeah.
Square it like this, and give me a hook. Hook. Jab, cross, hook, and then we'll go like this, all right?
1, 2, 3.
Now, what age might you consider to be old?
Probably 80 or 90. He could just do everything that I told him to do. An age that I would consider to be old now might be 100.
Do you remember what you said?
Yeah, I said in the 50s. I thought that would be old. But when I thought about it, like...
Wait a minute.
How can I do it? It really changed my thinking of what old is. You've taught me something today. Clearly, there's no way she's old, you know?
Now I know from today, hey, I don't look at age.
At my age, I feel like I did when I was in my 20s.
There's so many things that I still want to do. There's so many things that I can do. As long as I'm growing and learning, then age doesn't matter.
When people start stopping, that's when they start getting old.
I'm feeling like sunshine, like springtime, like something's in the water and I'm taking a deep dive. I'm feeling so weightless, like I'm gonna make it, and nothing in the universe universe can take this. I can see it clearly now. Nothing gonna bring me down.